This lesson is learning how to organize your APIs using router classes. The objectives for this lesson are to learn why you need a router class. We're going to create a base class with an add routes method. We're going to create router classes that inherit from that base class. And we're going to learn how to inject into these router classes. And we're going to learn how to invoke the add routes method very generically. So what is a router class and why do we need one? Well, this is not a Microsoft thing. I created this concept of a router class in an article that I wrote for Code Magazine in 2022. And I did it as a way to help me declutter the Program.cs file and group all my app.mapGet methods within a class. So I have an add routes method that I'm going to call to register all of my app.mapGet endpoints. So this means that I have the ability to have all these router classes participate in dependency injection. And I do that by registering all routes by calling the add routes on each router class. And we're going to do this very generically. So we'll start out and show you kind of the basics of it, and then we'll get into how to make the process a little bit more generic. We're going to start out by creating a router base class. And the reason why is all app.mapGet endpoints have a couple things in common. They have a URL and a tag name. I mean, we've seen it already when we created our app.mapGet methods. The first string that we pass in is usually the same. It might have a few additional pieces after it, but the basics are always the same. And also the tag name that we add to do the grouping. So we're going to create two properties for these two strings in our base class. We'll create a virtual add routes method that each router class will override. And we're going to pass in the instance of the web application object to our add routes. If you want more information on the router classes, like I said, I wrote an article for Code Magazine in 2022, and you can look it up here at this link. Let's create our router base class. Right mouse click on your project and add a new folder called Base Classes. Then right mouse click on that and add a class called Router Base. Now what we're going to do is we're going to replace the code in here with some code that I've got pre-written. And it's very simple. We've added two public properties, URL fragment and tag name, that you see on lines 11 and 12. I then initialize those to an empty string in the constructor. And we've added on our public abstract void add routes, passing in a web application object. So we're going to use this now for all of our router classes. We're going to create our product router class. It's going to inherit from that base class. We're going to override the add routes method, and we're going to take those app.mapGet endpoints out of Program.cs and move them into this add routes method. Then each of the app.mapGet methods is going to simply call protected methods get and getIntID. So those were the functionality within the app.mapGet methods that we had in Program.cs. Once we have that done, we can create an instance of the product router class in Program.cs and invoke the add routes method on this router class. Let's go ahead and create our product router class, and we'll just create the one get method for right now. Right mouse click again on the project and add a new folder called Router Classes. Right mouse click on that folder and add a class called Product Router. Now we're going to create many other ones too, right? You could create a customer router and an employee router, and all of the functionality for all the APIs for those particular nouns are going to go into those classes. And we're going to always create the same type of thing here. We're going to have some using statements. We're going to have a namespace. It'll all be under router classes. I'm going to create the public class product router that inherits from router base. I'm going to have a constructor that I'm going to set the URL fragment and the tag name properties. So for this one, it's API/product, and the tag name will be product. You then override that abstract method, add routes, passing in a web application object. And then on line 21, we're going to have our first app.mapGet here, which is going to be simply API/product. And the function is actually going to call the get method that you see on line 28. So protected virtual iResult get. And everything else is the same. The with tags, the produces, those are all the same that we wrote before. But the functionality for getting the data and returning that all falls within the get method. So it's going to keep our add routes method. It's going to keep that very clean because we're just going to make calls down to methods that you see here. Now let's go over to our Program.cs and locate the app.mapget/API/product that we're replacing with the code in the product router. So as you can see, all of that is code that we've now duplicated over in the product router. So we can delete all of this code. And all we have to do now is say new product router. And if you hit tab here, it should add the using statement for you. .add routes. And we're going to pass in the application object. So what it does is it makes the call at this point over to the add routes method here. It calls the get. Now notice on line 33, I've actually gone backwards. I'm actually using the new product repository .get. I'm not using dependency injection here yet, and that's coming up. I'm going to show you that in just a few minutes. But if we've done everything correctly, I should be able to run this now. So everything's still coming up correctly here, which is great. And if we now try it out and we execute, we should still get the full list of all those products here in our response body. Well, let's further get our Program.cs decluttered by taking that other method to get a single product in the router class, and let's move that off into that product router class. So in the product router, let's go ahead and add the same type of code that we wrote for the get, passing in the ID. So you can see this is exactly the same code that we had written earlier in the Program.cs, but I've now added it within the router class. And then we're going to modify the add routes, and we'll add this additional route here. And you can see that I'm using the URL fragment / and then look at that, ID:'int. So that looks exactly like what we created before. And then we're simply calling the get with the ID and passing that ID. So if we go back to Program.cs, we can now just simply remove this whole mapping as well, because it's now all included within this one line here on line 50. So let's go ahead and run this. And again, we get our product ID, type in a valid one, and we execute, and everything is still working perfectly. Now, obviously, you want to take advantage of dependency injection, but the problem is when you instantiate the object yourself. Remember, I did a new product router there in Program.cs. Well, you can't use dependency injection. You must let ASP.NET instantiate your objects. So that means you have to add our router classes to that services collection. Then we need to write generic code to instantiate all router classes. Let's take a look at injecting into our router classes. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add our router classes as a service. So I'm going to put it up here after the add and configure services comment. And I'll put a little comment there, add router classes as a service. So again, this is just another clue for us that this is where we do specific things. Builder.services.add_scoped, router base. So it's not an interface this time, but it's a base class that all of these router classes are going to inherit from. And then this one happens to be the product router. Now, wherever we did that code before that said new product router add routes, we're going to replace that code now with this code. So I've got another nice big comment area that says create minimal API endpoints by adding routes from all router classes and then run the application. What I'm doing is I'm creating a scope for the services container, and I'm going to then do var services equals scope.serviceprovider.getServices on router base. What this does is it goes into the services provider collection. It finds all instances of anything that's a router base. I then iterate over that router base collection that we get, and on each one I invoke the add routes method. So I can add the routes, again, passing in the app object. Then, and this is very important, you must move the running of the application. You must move it within the scope here. By doing that, that makes sure that all of our router classes can work with dependency injection. Let's go and modify our product router a bit so we can prove that injection actually works. Open up the product router. We're now going to add a new read-only field up here, and we're going to modify the constructor a little bit. So the constructor, I'm going to do some dependency injection here, and I'm going to set the repo equal to _repo. So this is dependency injection. I'm saying, hey, I know that there's a product repository already in the services container. The product router is now taking advantage of dependency injection because it's in the service container. It can inject the repo here. So once we have that product repository now in here, that means I can once again eliminate this code, and we did this before, right? And I just have to now use that repository object like we did before. All right, again, let's save all of the changes here. Let's try running this. And if I've done everything correctly, which I believe I have, we should be able to try this out. And look at that, it's going out. It's getting all those hard-coded products, and it's displaying them. Try the one with the individual ID here, and we put in 760, for example. We do an execute, and we get our product object back. So wonderful. Our product router class is now working with dependency injection. Now remember those very simple routes that I created at the very beginning of this course? Let's take those and move those into a router class as well. Right mouse click on the router classes folder, add a class called Simple Router. And look at the code that we're putting in on this one. We're doing using the AdventureWorks base classes. We're doing a namespace of AdventureWorks API router classes, creating a simple router that inherits from router base. We create a constructor that sets the URL fragment and the tag name. And then I'm taking those routes that we created at the very beginning of this course and I move them into the add routes. So once I have all of that done, we can go over to our Program.cs here. And after the product router, we're going to add this new router class as a service. We can then scroll down and we can delete all of those simple ones. And if we go ahead and run this, we still see our simple API calls. We can execute them. They give us back what we expected. But what's happening now, right, is down here in this loop, where on line 56, I grab that collection of services that inherit from router base. I now have two of them because I've registered two. We're looping through each one and invoking that add routes. And let's go ahead and get rid of our settings APIs that we created in Program.cs and move them into their own router class as well. Right mouse click on the router classes folder, add a class called Settings Router, and into this we're going to replace the code there with the same code that we had in the Program.cs. We create a Settings Router class that inherits from router base. In the constructor, we set the URL fragment to API/settings and the tag name to settings. And then our add routes simply has our app.map gets that we had before. In the product router, if you remember, I actually was injecting into the constructor. Here, I'm actually injecting into each individual endpoint. You can do either one. They both work because they are both going to be a part of dependency injection, because what we're going to do is over here in Program.cs, we're going to add that settings router as part of our services collection. We're then going to come down here and we are going to get rid of those settings APIs because now everything is in a router class, which means now when we're looping through three different services that inherit from router base. All of their add routes get registered. When we run this, we should see all of our APIs now appear within our Swagger. In this lesson, we saw that there's a lot of benefits to creating router classes. That router base class provides the interface, and we invoked all those add route methods generically. This is huge for keeping our Program.cs file clean and neat, and it helps organize all of our APIs into classes. Coming up next, add logging to Web API calls.